Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming to my talk, Decision Analysis Applications in Threat Analysis Frameworks. Again, I'm Emily Shawgo. Just a little bit about me to get started because it kind of informs where this talk came from. So this stemmed out of my thesis research from my master's degree. I just received my Master of Science in Public Policy and Management with a concentration in Cybersecurity Management from Carnegie Mellon University this year. Prior to that, I actually got my bachelor's degree in Psychology and Political Science from Carlow University in Pittsburgh. So I kind of took a little bit of a pivot in my career path, which sort of allowed me to bring the different perspectives into this research. So just a quick agenda here. I'm going to go through the background of how I came to this point of feeling this research was important, my methodology, myself performing this research, the methodology of the framework that I have developed, some future directions that I hope this research can take with me or with others in the future, and then I'll wrap up, and if we have time, I'll take some questions. So one thing that is tends to be a problem in cybersecurity is that human factor. And historically, the human factor has not been considered enough in security. That's starting to change. However, still to this day, when we think about the human factor in security, we think of the human as the vulnerability. So we think about the computer grandma who clicks on the phishing email, that sort of thing. So the human is very much a part of the vulnerability end. But unfortunately, the threat actor is still that hacker in the hoodie with no face. We don't really think about the threat actor as a human who is making decisions in real time. And the fact that, we have imperfect information as defenders, but they have imperfect information too. And how do we use that to our advantage in security? And one area of security that's really becoming very important is research on APTs, Advanced Persistent Threats. And these are threat actor groups that are usually attributed to attacks either because they take credit for them or because their MO is consistent. And their consistency has allowed them to be a great subject of security research. And finally, because it's an interest of mine, I wanted to look at the behavioral and decision analysis aspects of security. And one very important area of that I'll just give a shout out to here is the game theory perspective. There is some research out there on that I found that was very interesting. It's also very math heavy. It's not something that your average person in security or in any field other than economics or math can look at and say, oh, I understand how this is relevant to me. So that was something that I felt was a gap that I wanted to begin to fill with this research. So the first thing I had to do was kind of find an approach to take with this research. To start with, I wanted to get access to aggregated pen test data because pen testers emulate threat actors. They emulate all different kinds of threat actors. So that would have been a great way for me to look at and say, oh, here's what's happening. Here's something that like an organization will sign off on because it wasn't, a real breach or anything like that. Turns out that's actually very hard to get an organization to sign off, even anonymized. I mean, I had great contacts through my university who did everything they could to help me get this data. That was not going to happen. So the next thing I tried to do was, what if I could just get one? What if I could look at one set of pen test data from one engagement? Would this work? Nope, no one would let me use this data. So I kind of had to take a step back. By this point, I had committed to this as my thesis, and I'm starting to panic a little bit. And I'm thinking, man, how can I do this that I can still reach the desired objective? And so basically what I ended up doing was taking a very theoretical approach using publicly available information. So what I ended up doing was I decided to focus on APTs because of the consistency of their behavior, because that's what a lot of other organizations use to develop threat frameworks, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. So I decided to take just some specific examples. So I looked at APT&CK and Turtle Group. Turtle Group I looked at because it's very simple. Their attack strategies are usually very straightforward. That's going to be the one that I'll demo here in a little bit because it's shorter and I can do that. APT&CK I also modeled just for sheer magnitude because they have so many attack vectors and so many different things that they do. I have it included in here just for the magnitude of it. It was unpleasant. So I wanted to incorporate elements of existing frameworks rather than reinventing the wheel. So the first thing I looked at is, of course, what everyone is familiar with, the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. 7 steps, it's very linear, it's usually only applied to APTs. Generally, is a very good model to stick to, but it has many flaws that are kind of being addressed. And one of the ways, or one of the frameworks trying to address these is the MITRE attack framework, which I'm only looking at the actual attack, not the pre-attack. This was actually there was a talk on this yesterday. It was very interesting, and I shout out to them. But so basically it takes those last 4 steps that are effectively the same as the kill chain, but it goes into more detail. So what are those specific categories of what a threat actor can do once they're acting on your framework? So basically what I wanted to do was I wanted to take those existing frameworks and I wanted to incorporate that aspect of human decision making and the fact that an attack might not be linear. If you foil one step of an attack, that doesn't mean you're done. And that was something that, while it's alluded to in the other frameworks, it kind of means that like you have to almost start from scratch. So I wanted to think, how can we not start from scratch? How can we take probability or other things that the threat actor is doing and kind of include those? So the first thing in an organization to apply this framework is identify top threats. So I picked my threats just as ones that were interesting, but for a particular organization, you'd want to look for ones in your sector. For example, there are specific threats to the financial sector or to government, something like that. Perhaps to a particular geographic area or to a size of an organization. And there's reports being put out every year on what those top threats to look for are. And then the next step is to research that group's attack methods. Now that's something, if you're working specifically with APTs, there's a great repository on that from Rapid7, from MITRE, from types of organizations like that. If you're looking at something a little bit more obscure, you might have to work from your organization's own historical data. Were you breached in the past by an attacker? Is that something you're worried about again? What did they do? So then, the next thing that you'll do is to form the decision tree, which I'll show here in a moment, to understand what the primary and secondary attacks. So for example, perhaps a group's initial attack vector is usually spear phishing, but they have other things in their back pocket if that doesn't work. And perhaps once they've phished their way onto your network, they have something that they might implement on your account, but if they can't do it because you don't have privileges, then they try to move to a privileged account, things like that. So once you have this tree put together, that's where you start to work within the organization to synthesize with known weaknesses in your group. So here, I'll just actually move to this. So this is the example decision tree that I made for Turla Group. I hope you all can see it from here. So basically what I did was I started pretty much their initial attack vector attempt is always spear phishing. That made them very easy to model. So if they're successful, then they move on to the step of process discovery, et cetera, and so forth. And if they fail, then they move to the alternate method of trying to brute force credentials. So basically, as you're moving through this tree, what I went ahead and highlighted here in red is the points at which the attack would be considered failed if they were unsuccessful because there'd be nowhere else for them to go. And then in green, I went ahead and highlighted at what point would you be breached? Would their attack be officially successful? So the way this can be used within the organization is to then look at, would your organization have methods to defend against things within process discovery or lateral movement? Are those controls in place? If those controls aren't in place, then you know that that is something that is of concern within the organization and should be a priority for mitigation. I also feel like this was something that I kind of came upon as I was working, is that the critical nodes are really those places where you have a red and a green. So those are really the points where you can say, okay, if they reach this point and they're successful, then I've been breached. If they reach this point and they fail, they're done. So those are things that I feel like as an organization it's really important to focus on. Now, here's the tree that I went ahead and made for APT10. I put this up here just to show how complex this can get. I don't expect you to be able to read any of that because the print's super tiny, but this was actually even a slight simplification because spear phishing isn't always their initial attack vector, but I went ahead and did this assuming that it was, and even with that, we're looking at many, many layers. So this is something that can really get into very high orders of magnitude very quickly, but it's still all functioning in that same way. So each branch ends with that critical green-red node, and there are many places of attack failure along the way to look at. So some of the limitations that I encountered while working was, one of them was obviously I didn't get to work with live data, I didn't get to work with something organization specific or with a simulated attack that had actually occurred. That would have been something that someone could work with in the future and would be very interesting because then you could see how an organization could actually apply this to their own situation instead of just working with a general APT. Also, this is very theoretical and it lacks math foundations. I am not a statistician or a mathematician. I'm very interested in those fields. I feel like a future direction for this would be to start to include things like probabilities. But that is not something that I was able to do at this time. And if anyone has expertise in that, I'd love to hear from you. Side note. Really then the question is, what can organizations gain from this? So like I said, it can be used for prioritizing mitigations. What are those critical nodes where an attack will succeed or fail? And prioritizing those as top concerns. And also within that, just also seeing what are the other steps along the way. So it's also important to know not to get too caught up in those critical endpoints, because if you can stop them earlier in the attack, all the better. But really, to kind of consider all of those things. It's also, you can personalize your corporate policy in this way. So really to say, I'm going to look at these threats within this sector are the most concern to us. Basically, at that point, you're not just working with, so one of the things with the attack framework is you have this big grid of a whole bunch of attack methods. That can be very overwhelming. This way, you've simplified it to a very linear process. How can I end this branch? How can I end that branch? How can I stop this whole tree entirely? And although I've modeled it with APTs, I can't stress enough, it can be used for many other types of attackers as long as you have some data either from your own history or from open source or from a partner that might have access to that. You could very easily model the insider threat or the script kiddie. You could do those things very easily. All right, so at this point, I'll open it up to questions. I also have my Twitter on here. My DMs are open. It's just my name. If anyone wants to reach out to me with questions later.
So first of all, thanks for the talk. Two questions or comments. The first one is based specifically for the APTs that you have kind of a history record of their incidents. Did you think about giving a weight, talking about the probability of moving between one lift to another?
That's where I would love to have someone with more of that statistics probability background to work with on this. That's a direction I would love to see it go in. I tried a little bit to do that, but I did not have enough, personally, I did not have enough confidence in those numbers to include that into the actual presentation.
Yeah, so that, yeah, absolutely, that's one idea. The other one is, you have used the binary decisions kind of trees. I can see, cases where you might want to look even at multiple kind of options for each and every steps rather than just two.
I did not include one where I did this. I did actually have some that I played around with where I had 3 or 4 as a tree. Actually, I remember now, I didn't include them because they were just huge and you couldn't read anything. But that's absolutely, yes, that is very true that like this is not necessarily binary. There's always more than two choices.
Great job.
So thanks, yeah, fantastic talk. I just wanted to mention, I've just been in a talk by Fox IT, Paul Poles, and he was talking about a unified framework that brings together MITRE, the kill chain, and some red team activities to fill in the gaps between those frameworks. And that could be really useful to taking this to the next level. Also seeing how things branch between trees, because he made the point that very rarely, from a kill chain perspective, when you red team, do things happen in that order.
Sure.
So it'd be fascinating to take that kind of analysis and look at it against that. And if you want to talk about someone who might have some data to play with
Thank you so much.
in a few months, then yeah, let's definitely keep that conversation going, because that was a great presentation. I'd love to use that framework.
Thank you.
Thanks. It was a really good idea that you have here. What would be neat is to add some percentages of impact. So the cost of these different type of breaches at these, or loss of information at this point in time. But what's really, really neat about this is that it gives you the ability to communicate to business leaders in a way that they can understand it related to the money, because that they use this same type of framework in game theory, like you mentioned, as well as cost analysis for, if you're going to buy this company versus buying that company versus, it's great. This is really a good way to communicate to business leaders.
Thank you.
Hey, great job. I had a question about like how you, how long did it take you to do this once you have like the source data and you're like, you want to go from this source data into having, one of these decision trees built? How long did that take? And do you think is that something you could operationalize over time in a way that's like cost effective?
So for me, actually, it really didn't, because I basically just pulled from the two sources of MITRE and Rapid7 for that data on the attack vectors. So, I did one of these in a day. The more complicated ones, I took a couple of days just because I needed to walk away from them for a little while. But generally, I would say it all depends on how good your input data is. If it's very compartmentalized and it's very easy for you to just say, oh, here are the 3 initial attack vectors, then that's a very quick thing. So I think, to answer your question, I think the operationalizing comes not so much from building the trees as from inputting that data. If you have a good repository, it's very quick to do.
Thank you. So from your perspective, how well do you think this will scale such that it can still be analyzed visually, and have you considered options for analyzing it once it's too big to analyze visually? Sure,
there are decision tree softwares out there that could be used to kind of produce a comprehensive report that isn't the visual tree. I like the visual tree. I think that's very good to hand people who aren't mathy, aren't really into the nuts and bolts of it. I think it very much depends on the situation. Certainly, if you're working with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknowns, for example, if you're working with something that's more of a broad vector of the insider threat, for example, that's very, very broad, and you might find yourself dealing with something with too much of a scale. So I think what's really important is just getting everything as specific as possible so that you have that good repository of data and you have a very narrow scope.
And when you say but when you say specific, are you referring to the ontologies you used to quantify the nodes?
Yes.
So attack or whatnot?
Yes.
Like that?
So I think if I go back here, I went ahead and specifically mapped this to the terms used in the MITRE framework, for example. So I would say, brute force can mean a lot of things. So if you're working in a situation where you have to protect against multiple types of situations, then maybe you have to make that more specific. Mm-hmm. Does that kind of answer your question? Okay.
Now, do you envision this potentially, do do you think it would benefit, or do you think it would have a negative impact to go beyond tree graphs to either acyclic or cyclic graphs in a more general structure?
That would be very interesting. I think the benefit of this is that it still kind of sticks within that linear visual format that people are kind of used to seeing with things like the kill chain. I think the cyclical would be more compact. So I think that's very interesting to see, because, you know, if you fail at one thing, then you go back a few steps and try again.
Thank you.
Yeah, again, great talk. One thing this kind of reminds me of, and of course everyone's kind of mentioned probability, is Bayesian nets. And you know, one thing that's often done in Bayesian nets for things like this is to annotate these with controls and mitigations, pointing into some of those attack vectors, so you can then show what controls and mitigations you have in place and how those reduce the ability of an attacker to successfully execute those. So that might be another way to bring some of the probability to this.
Yeah, great point. Thank you.
That was a good talk. So I'm kind of new to the cybersecurity part of the kill chain, but kill chains are used other places, I guess, and my experience has been with electronic warfare. And I'm just wondering if you've had any exposure to that. I mean, electronic warfare has been doing kill chains for quite a long time, and I just wonder if there's some maybe experience or ways of thinking about the kill chain, because we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how do I break various links, and there's lots of different ways to present that information. And I would say it might be hard finding somebody who's wanting to talk to you about that, but I still think there's going to be plenty of information, that's out there on the web. I mean, it's funny that Lockheed Martin is the one that documented this kill chain, because obviously they are involved in electronic warfare stuff, and they do it there all the time. So, but anyway, just another area maybe is just to see what lessons learned came from, or could come from that might help you in the presentation and figuring out where the weak links are.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I don't know anything personally about that area, but I'd love to hear more about how that could be applied. Thank you. All right, thanks so much.